Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are watching us from. It is a great pleasure to start translating our first international symposium on NEC and intestinal rehabilitation. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I think that the pandemic gave us opportunities such as this to have people from all over Brazil and abroad, but also with some technological challenges. That's why we are 10 minutes late. I'd like to thank you for your patience, and I think that this is going to be a very nice meeting. I'll start introducing myself and introducing PGG. We will dedicate the symposium to all infants that are struggling, have struggled, or have left us because of NEC. And in a tribute to all of the families, because we think that the small, great warriors we come, they always have great warriors backing them up. We devote the symposium to some people who were fundamental for us to be able to put together this symposium and who are no longer with us. The people whose names are on the screen. 6 months ago, we had Serena. Unfortunately, we're having a lot of sound cuts. Well, Serena is no longer with us. So Serena is no longer here. And I think that this makes our symposium, our meeting, even more necessary for us to address the topic of intestinal rehabilitation. Some housekeeping messages. Some housekeeping messages. I told you that we're having many tech challenges here. So housekeeping. We will be getting questions using the chat feature. The speakers will be available after the event. So if you have questions, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions during their presentations and then during the Zoom interactive room. A lot of people signed up today, and we didn't have time to send them an email with the respective Zoom meetings. We have one Zoom meeting, 2 breakout sessions, one for families, one for HCPs. So please go to the appropriate room. And I'd like to remind you that this symposium is being recorded, but the breakout sessions will not be recorded. We want to protect the privacy of everyone, particularly the families. We want to create an empathic and safe environment for the families. Regarding how long the presentations will last, they'll last about 12 minutes and we'll reserve 2 to 3 minutes for questions. So I'd like to ask my fellow speakers to please limit yourselves to the time you have, or else I'll have to mute your mic, just like in the Oscar ceremony. I would hate to do that, so please don't make me do it. A little bit about myself, but I'm going to try to solve the problem of my sound. There's a lot of echoing for some reason. I apologize for that. Ms. Campbell, can you hear the English translation now? Great.
Yes, thank you. It was because I was on my phone for audio, so I'm sorry about that. I'm back on my computer and now I can see it.
Again, I'm sorry, these are technological challenges. I'm the first one speaking, so I'm going through all of these challenges, trying to get a grip on what I'm doing. A little bit about myself. I think our goal here is to show why PGG Institute was created. So what was the motivation behind PGG? What led us to create PGG? I'm Simone Rosito. Like I said, I'm founder and chairman of PGG Institute, and it all began on July 10th, 2015, when I got twin nephews, Antonio and Daniel. They were preemies, born at 7 months gestation, and Daniel had more than 1.5 kilo, but on about 1,500 grams. He needed to go through surgery soon after birth. But he recovered really well from surgery. At 20 days, Daniel was discharged. He went home, and we thought it was just a matter of time for Tom to follow him. He was doing well. He was putting on weight. But then he became a little lethargic, refusing to eat. And when he was 25 days old, my sister got a call from the neonatal ICU asking her to rush to the hospital because Tom would need a second surgery. At the time, they said that he had abdominal distension. And to me, when I think about abdominal distension, I think about muscle exercise. I didn't really understand how an infant could have abdominal distension. And something else that was very impactful is that surgery lasted hours. And of course, you want to get convinced that it's not a serious thing, then it's nothing to worry about, that whatever abdominal distension in an infant is, it's not serious. But in such an infant, when surgery lasts so many hours, you start getting worried. When the surgery was over, we were informed that Antonio, or Tom, had this disease called necrotizing enterocolitis. I had never heard about NEC. And during surgery, he had a cardiac arrest that they had to stop the surgery for a while. And what they told my sister was, look, get ready. This baby is going to be in the hospital for a long time, and don't Google NEC. Well, I Googled it. And what I found, well, first it was very technical. Everything was in English, very hard to understand. And the little I understood was not very encouraging. And in my mind, I started thinking, okay, Antonio came to a good, loving family. He's having access to good health care. But the more I read about necrotizing enterocolitis, the more I realized that NEC is an uncommon, but not that rare disease. There are many infants and babies affected by it. So I started thinking, what about those families that are in cities that cannot count on very good health care and that do not have information about the disease? How are they coping with this? And that's when we started thinking about building an institution that would provide psychological assistance to families of babies affected by the disease. And that was the embryo of PGG. I keep talking to people, and my background has nothing to do with healthcare or NGO. I'm from the financial market. That's all I've done in my life. So this was all new to me. And I can tell you that what motivated me was my love for my nephew. I had zero experience with that, but I was lucky enough that I found many people helping me, giving me tips and saying, but Simone, what other organizations in the world focus on NEC? And I have the privilege of finding NEC Society. It is a great privilege to be in partnership with the NEC Society, putting together this event, because Jennifer and Erin, they are sisters of ours in this cause. So we are very aligned in terms of how we want to build a world without necrotizing enterocolitis. I also got a lot of support from other people. People who help me, and they say, oh, but I can only help a bit. But if you help a bit, somebody else helps a bit, we can achieve a lot. And I think that this symposium today is a great achievement. Talking more about Antonio, well, his story is it goes in parallel with PGG. PGG was created very quickly. Tom was born on July 10th, 2015. PGG was founded in May 9th, 2016. And Tom left us. on May 21st, 2016. He had the short bowel syndrome and ended up passing away due to complications of short bowel syndrome. It was a big blow, and they asked, will you continue with PGG? And I thought, of course. Tom came to teach us a lesson. I'll do it for Tom. And so that no one else will have to go through what we went through. And I will keep doing this. And this is the story of PGG Institute. I'm telling you my personal story here because with all of these challenges to connect technically, well, at least I have to talk a little about my story. This is me, this is Simone, and I'm always smiling, and this is what drives me. Now, speaking a little about PGG, I'd like to invite everyone to visit our website. I'll leave my email address. So if you have questions about PGG or about the presentations of the other speakers, if we don't have time to answer all of your questions, send me an email. I will answer all of the questions. Please follow us on social media. We are Instituto PGG. And please follow our sister organizations, NEC Society, NEC UK, and NEC Alliance from Australia. We work close together in this struggle. When one organization gets stronger, we all get stronger. And we need donations, we need followers, because these followers increase our outreach, and we need volunteers. So if you're interested, if you want to get in touch with us, you have my email. Now I would like to continue reminding you of what I said here. I had the help of many people to create PGG Institute, and the person I'm going to call now is a person that is a privilege to have in our board. It's a person who is even more beautiful inside than outside. She does wonders to expand our cause. I'm going to call Isabella Fiorentino. She's our ambassador. If you're not from Brazil, Isabella is a mother of triplets, preemies. She's a TV presenter, and she's very much engaged with social causes. And it is a great privilege to count on Isabella in our struggle. Isabella, over to you. Thank you very much, Simone. Can you all see me? Oh, good. I'm not the very best regarding technology, but can I continue? Well, to begin, I would like to say a huge thank you for being invited to be here and to participate with PGG. I know that Simone put a great fight to organize this event, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you. I'd like to thank the physicians from Brazil and abroad, the families who are in mourning or who are with their infants in the hospital. I'm here to extend my solidarity to all of them. I'd like to say that my role at PGG, in addition to my good intention to want to embrace this cause in all possible ways, I don't have a lot of technical knowledge, just like Simona. I don't have a background in healthcare, but I like to say that I would have been a doctor. I'm in love with medicine. If I were not a top model, I would have been a good doctor because I'm really devoted to my studies. And since I got pregnant with the triplets, I always did a lot of research. I bought a book that said week by week what was happening with my babies, what they were developing along the pregnancy. And Simone said that she had never heard about necrotizing enterocolitis, and neither had I. My babies were born at 27 weeks gestational weight, extremely preemies. The smallest had only 700 grams. Bernardo with 1 kilo, Lawrence's with 1.2 kilo. And never in my life did I imagine that something like that could ever happen with my babies and with all of the babies in the neonatal ICU. We went very difficult moments. One of my children had a grade 4 brain hemorrhage, and he has cerebral palsy today. When we left the hospital, a TV presenter had told me about a companion of a child who needed an intestinal transplant. And I said, yes, let's talk about it. We went on TV. We were able to raise money for that baby to undergo multivisceral transplantation in the US. Well, after a while, whom do I meet? Simone Rosito. Tom was still alive and fighting for his life. And he said, Bella, I need to speak about something with you. It's a disease nobody talks about, and exercising enterocolitis. And I was taken aback. I said, I'm very much involved in this campaign. I want to help you. I visited Tom and many other infants in the hospital, and they realized that we need to shed some light in this disease because it's preventable if people knew more. So I think this is my role, is to talk about it, to raise awareness, so that when we think about intestinal or abdominal distension, we think about gas, right? But it can be very serious, and mothers can understand that this can happen with preemies. So I am here, and I want to follow the presentations here. And I'd like to thank you, Simone, because you chose me as your advisor and as your godmother. So I'm going to call on somebody who's crucial in our team, Dr. Walusa Assad, who is going to talk about the challenges of necrotizing enterocolitis in Brazil. Dr. Walusa Assad, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Great. First and foremost, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be here. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. And I would like to congratulate the PGG Institute. This kind of initiative of bringing together society and physicians is always going to make us better and is always going to help us achieve better results. So right now, during the pandemic, we are trying to achieve more unity. And this is a very good webinar for that. Okay, so today I will be talking about NEC in Brazil with its challenges, incidents, and needs. Let me tell you what we see with NEC in Brazil, and let me tell you what we know about enterocolitis in Brazil. In this opening session, I want to foster a conversation about how Brazil and other countries has been approaching NEC. In our literature, we see different pieces of research showing the incidence of enterocolitis, especially in developed countries. Now, this work, published by the Dinamood Group, showed a 1.6 incidence of enterocolitis in Japan when we talk about children over 1.5 kilograms. Now, in Poland, we see 8.7%. And as you can see, even in developed countries, we have a very specific incidence. And we have a lot of variance here. We also need to understand what we are talking about. Here we are talking about children with a birth weight under 1.5 kilograms or under 1 kilogram. However, we are no developed country. We are a developing country. So let me tell you what we have. We have this review published in 2020. In this research, we see 27 cohort studies reporting the incidence of NEC. They studied almost 40,000 children with NEC, with a total incidence of 6%. and why this is interesting. Developed countries have a higher incidence, but when this study analyzed developing countries, we saw an incidence of 3%. And this is not real. We are probably saying that because we have high levels of mortality and we have a lot of difficulty when diagnosing this disease. Reaching an enterocolitis diagnosis in hospitals with not many resources is a big challenge, and it is very important for us to achieve that to save preemies in Brazil. So let's talk a little bit about science and enterocolitis. Now, if we use descriptors at PubMed, we're going to see many articles on enterocolitis. However, many of these articles, which are not conceptual, are going to reflect the incidence of this disease in the countries in red, which are wealthier countries, which are able to take care of their preemies. However, we are among the countries in salmon, and we represent 76% of the world population. Now, this is what this means. Think about the amount or number of premature babies that are born in our countries, and think about how much we are not contributing to the evolution of research about this disease, since we don't produce as much science. We also need to think that many works talk about low and middle income countries. That applies to us in salmon. However, we have lower income countries in blue. So the results that we see and that try to approach our reality may not be accurate because they are actually putting together two different realities of low income countries and middle income countries. And in Brazil and in the BRICS, we know that we need to produce our science to help our children. That is why I'm bringing you this topic. We need to get closer together and we need to foster research. And I would like to thank the PGG Institute for fostering enterocolitis research in Brazil. We also have something very important here about governmental investment opportunities to work on enterocolitis. The cost of a child with enterocolitis is extremely high. So for the government, it makes sense to invest in prevention of enterocolitis and on enterocolitis care. But it's better to invest in prevention. We need to demand that from the government. So we've talked about incidence, and we've established that we need more research because what we have right now may not reflect our reality. But let's talk about Brazil more specifically. Now, before starting this webinar, I was checking out what we have in research on enterocolitis in Brazil, and unfortunately, we have basically nothing. This one is from 2019 from the Brazilian Neonatal Network. In this network, we have 20 Brazilian public hospitals, especially university-run hospitals. With a database and prospective collection, we were able to analyze our reality. However, this reflects only the reality of 5% of newborns in Brazil. So as a network, we have understood that we need to work on the incidence of enterocolitis. And treatment has been the same for decades. When someone develops enterocolitis, it is very hard for us to avoid lesions. So it is better for us to prevent the appearance or the onset of enterocolitis. We also see that we have around 9% as the figure for enterocolitis in the country. And do you know the incidence of enterocolitis in your hospital facility? This is a poll for you. Do you also know about the necessary interventions? And please remember that enterocolitis is related to mortality. So oftentimes incidence is low because we have high levels of mortality for a certain age group. In Brazil, we have been getting better with survival. At 30 weeks, we have good survival, but when we have 24 weeks, we have high rates of mortality. But we are getting better, and we'll see a rising number of newborns with enterocolitis because this is what happens. The more preemies survive, the higher the risk of enterocolitis. That is why we need to study this disease and we need to invest in it. Now, in Brazil, 30% of our newborns are small for their gestational age, and that entails risks. That is a problem. This was a very interesting article analyzing the amount of DHE we had in milk, and we don't eat fish in the countryside of Brazil, so we have 0.9% of that in milk. And Japan is one of the countries with the smallest rates of enterocolitis, and we have this non-confirmed hypothesis that this could have something to do with that. They have low rates of enterocolitis and they eat a lot of fish. And we don't know if that's the case, but we need to analyze it. And our babies are not well nourished as well, and they are small. Another problem we face is late onset sepsis. We have around 30%. So this McElroy study approaching Latin America show that we usually have late onset sepsis for this rate. And usually this, in many cases, this is related to NEC. So we have small children who develop infections, and this is a boiler for enterocolitis. It really may lead to that. Here we have another survey for you. In your daily clinical practice, when do you investigate enterocolitis? Because I teach all over Brazil and I've seen peers who only investigate for enterocolitis when we have a lot of symptoms in the abdomen, but we also see peers who are able to investigate it and who decide to investigate it when we have vomiting and residue. So are you doing your investigation at the right time? Because this will have to do with your prognosis. Now, we also need to talk about when we start enteronutrition for our children. It's usually on their first day alive for our preemies. And this may be positive in Brazil because we use breast milk. We usually have breastfeeding and we use breast milk for these preemies. However, since we have high rates of cytomegalovirosis, it is a recommendation not to use this milk for children under 28 days old. It is also rare for us to use raw milk because of that. We have to wait for a while. And we have one of the biggest databases for milk in the world, one of the biggest milk banks, and this is funded by the Brazilian public healthcare system. We have 224 breast milk banks all over Brazil. We had over 2 million women donating milk. And over 2.8 million liters of human milk donated in 2019. We use breast milk and we have a lot of control measures. And this is very good for us because breast milk is about protection. So let me tell you where we are still struggling. Maybe with diagnosis. Because think about how we make this diagnosis. Is it only physical examination? Do we use radiographs? And I am looking forward to the talk by Dr. Kim because he's probably going to have a lot of information about it. And we also have ultrasounds. Do you have ultrasounds in your facilities? And are the operators experienced? Or are you relying on the interpretation of someone's professional experience? Do you even have a protocol in your facility to help save lives in this case? Because you may be getting to late diagnosis in your facilities. Also, do you assess predictors for NEC? And do we need a risk score in Brazil? And what is your suspicion score? As Isabella and Simone were saying, when do you think about NEC and when do you consider it? Also, do you invite parents to see the children in your facility and how much do they participate in the process? So this is our last survey. How do you go about diagnosing enterocolitis? Well, we didn't have much time and we'll be able to talk later in these sessions, but NEC is devastating. This kid is Miguel. He was beautiful when he was born, but unfortunately he had enterocolitis. Both him and his brother. His brother passed away, and unfortunately he had a bowel resection. It wasn't a major bowel resection, but of course, we do struggle with that. He didn't get SBS, but it is hard for us to take care of these children in the public healthcare system in Brazil. Now, I dare say that these mothers have to, find solutions on their own. He went through complications, and we do have an outpatient clinic in Ribeirão to take care of these children, but these are not available all over the country. He fought a lot. We worked together. We offered psychological support to the mother, and we do have therapy sessions getting to great results. I do recommend it. And Miguel is doing better. He's alive. He was able to have his guts rebuilt, and he is in a way well. This is a success story of enterocolitis. Of course, there are consequences here, but this is real life. And the rest of my presentation may have been a bit abstract, but this is real. Now, in Ribeirão, we have a lab to work specially with mice. And I don't have time to go into that, but we are now working on this project, and we are talking about the effect of thermal control for enterocolitis. We are now going into the human stage of this research. And Simone, we have a project to map out enterocolitis in Brazil. It's called the BrainNEC project. With the USP in Ribeirão and the PGG Institute, we want to map Brazil with the biggest hospitals, NEC incidents, and NEC predictors to look for better diagnosis and interventions in the country. As the NEC Society says, we want a world without NEC. And let's first start with a Brazil without NEC. Please join our Zoom session later to share your experience with these amazing speakers. It's going to be a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. Now I'd like to invite Jennifer Chemistry to speak about a world without necrotizing enterocolitis. Over to you, Jennifer. Jennifer, I don't know if you're talking, but we are not hearing you.
Sorry about that. I thought I unmuted, but I didn't. All right. Now you can hear me. So I was just saying, thank you all so much for having me, Simone. Congratulations on making this happen. It's such an honor and grateful to work with you all. So as I prepared for this presentation, I reflected on how and where my journey with NEC began. And I thought about how optimistic and hopeful I was in this photo with my son, Micah. This was one of the last photos I had with Micah before he developed necrotizing enterocolitis. And obviously that hope and optimism were just shattered when he was diagnosed with NEC and then crushed when he ultimately died from complications of the disease. But working with PGG and Simone and all of you who are tuning in today has really just restored my hope and my optimism for building a world without this devastating disease. So I thank you for your dedication. I actually had the pleasure of getting to know Simone when Tom was still physically with us. We exchanged stories and I learned how she was building a foundation to help other babies and families. And I knew right away that she would be an incredible partner and friend on this journey. But what I did not yet know was that her family would lose Tom in much the same way that my family lost Micah, which is months after their original NEC diagnosis, when we thought our toughest battles were really behind us. And when Simone shared the devastating news that Tom had passed, of course, my heart just broke for her family. And I also knew that we now shared this overwhelming sense of purpose and determination. And that's really when and how our journey of building an international movement for a world without NEC really started. And before I advance my slides, I just want to recognize that it is World Prematurity Day, where we raise awareness and we honor the babies who are born much too soon. Without a doubt, preemies are absolutely so remarkable and strong, including our babies that have lost their lives because of their rough start. But I also want to acknowledge that full-term infants can sometimes develop necrotizing enterocolitis too. And through the NEC Society, our families have really demonstrated that there are a lot of stories of babies being born at term developing NEC. And so just a reminder to all of us to recognize the unique experience of all families who are affected by this really devastating disease. Go to the next slide. So I'm compelled to help improve outcomes for babies who are at risk of NEC and their families because of what happened to my twins and because I know that my family's experience continues to happen to other families around the globe every day. And so my story begins with my twins, Micah and Zachary, being nearly born at 23 weeks gestation. I was healthy, I was young, I had access to high quality healthcare and information. And still, despite everything that I was doing right, I went into preterm labor at 23 weeks gestation. And I was told that both my babies would likely die if they were born that early. Thankfully, my care team was able to stop my labor from advancing and I remained on hospitalized bed rest for weeks. Mike and Zachary were ultimately born at 27 weeks gestation, weighing just over 1,000 grams. As their first weeks of life went by, they gained weight, they became increasingly stable and healthy. And so these two photos that you see here were taken when the twins were about 6 weeks old. And at this time, I felt very hopeful and optimistic. I could feel that my babies would be coming home soon. And I just felt like they're going to be okay at this point. But tragically, I was very wrong. Just hours after this photo of Micah was taken, he became really, really sick and developed necrotizing enterocolitis. So he endured an exploratory laparotomy. His kidneys suffered from the infection as well as the nephrotoxic medication that he was receiving. And without his kidneys functioning at all, he became severely fluid overloaded to the point where he couldn't open his eyes. He could not move any part of his body. And we could really feel Micah slipping away. And of course, I was terrified of losing him. And I want to pause here for a moment and just share that if this could happen to our family, it could happen to any family. We had access to resources, information. We asked questions. My husband, Noah, was a resident, a young physician when our twins were born and spent their time in the NICU. We were constantly at our baby's bedside, and still it wasn't enough to save Micah. I will always believe that Micah's NEC was preventable and that if his care team would have listened to our questions and been a little bit more open, I think that Micah would probably have survived and even be here today with his twin brother who is now thriving. But instead I use all of those what ifs and the regrets and the energy to really propel my dedication to our international movement. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So miraculously, Micah survived his initial neck diagnosis. He endured several surgeries and bowel resections. And we were very fortunate that our hospital's incredible pediatric surgery and nephrology teams saved Micah's life by placing him on continuous renal replacement therapy. Micah did have short bowel syndrome and his kidneys never recovered, so he did develop end-stage renal disease. But despite these obstacles, we could really feel like our toughest days were behind us. Micah came home and we were working to get him to the weight requirement that he needed so that he could receive a kidney transplant. And we were very optimistic, very hopeful, but tragically, Micah never got to receive his kidney transplant. He was readmitted to the pediatric intensive care unit with pneumonia. And very quickly, all of Micah's months and months of progress slipped away. We were told that Micah was no longer eligible for a kidney transplant, and there was nothing left that they could do for him. And so we said goodbye to Micah on December 11th of 2012, and that was right before the twins' first Christmas and first birthday. So it's obviously very devastating. And I think, what's perhaps most compelling about my family story is that it's not unique. Families around the globe experience this same devastation from NEC every day. And it's not actually about Micah or me or even the NEC Society. It's really about what we can do collectively when we allow the energy and the love for our little ones to really drive us towards a purpose and a vision that's bigger than ourselves. So I'm going to transition over from my story to talking more about our international movement. So for anyone who is less familiar with the NEC Society, I'll just share that we are a nonprofit charity organization that's dedicated to bringing together patient families, clinicians, researchers, and other diverse stakeholders who are really committed to this work and advancing research and advocacy and education and awareness. And while we are based in the US, we're very committed to nurturing an inclusive and international environment and movement around NEC. And so I'm going to just highlight a few things of a few important reasons why I think we need a strong international movement. The first is that even though NEC is not rare in our NICUs, it is a rare disease. And so it means that collaboration is really essential to ensure that we're building upon each other's strengths and skills and the very limited resources that exist. I think for decades, NEC has too often been regarded as inevitable, something that was just bound to happen to some vulnerable babies, and there was nothing that we could really do about it. And I think, like a lot of you, I would reject this notion. And of course, we still have a lot of work to do to better understand NEC and ways that we can best prevent and treat the disease. There are things and ways that we can better prevent NEC right now. And I think an international movement really helps us to engage a broader, more diverse community of stakeholders who can help us move this work forward. And then finally, an international movement is really critical because it allows us to advance research that would be impossible or very difficult for us to do on our own. So I'm going to transition over to how we build an international movement and what we're doing to try to continue to build it. It's something that we're constantly working on. We're in the earliest stages right now, and I don't see this work as ever complete. It's something that we're always going to be working to build together. The first, I think it's so important that we are inclusive, meaning that we recognize and value all of the stakeholders at the table, their unique experiences and knowledge, whether their child died from NEC or whether they have operated on babies with NEC. And we just are constantly aiming to diversify our community and elevate each other, and especially voices who have maybe unique or different experiences than our own. We also really strive to center babies and families at every decision that's really core to our priorities, campaigns, projects, and research is keeping babies and families centered. And finally, just working to really cultivate trust and rapport, focusing on nurturing relationships between stakeholders so we can really optimize our ability to collaborate and advance the shared goals that we have. And then one thing I want to add also, is just fundamental, is the act of being intentional and deliberate. If we want to build a strong, diverse international movement around NEC, we really need to be strategic and intentional about bringing our values to life. It's not going to happen by us just talking about it, of course. So I'm so glad that we are working to make things happen. So what can we accomplish? I believe that we can accomplish so much more together than we could ever achieve on our own. An international movement really helps us to stay relevant. It keeps us motivated as we build each other up, and we find ways to overcome the obstacles, become sustainable. And so our movement can really outlast our own personal stories, because again, ultimately it's not about us, it's about future NICU babies and families. So among the many other things that our work can accomplish, I think here are a few that I'd just like to highlight. The first is research that's meaningful to families. You know, for decades, it's been these remarkable clinicians and scientists who have thankfully dedicated their careers to babies who are at risk of NEC. And they've been driving the research agenda. They've asked the research questions and designed the studies. And now we feel like it's time for families who've lived through the devastation of NEC to be at the table and to join the clinicians and scientists in advancing our shared research priorities. And then the next one is families are really the most essential member of their baby's care team. And so I feel like an international movement around NEC can really amplify our call for family integrated care in our NICUs so that families are informed, engaged, and empowered. And our movement, I think, really brings us increasingly closer to improving outcomes for all babies who are at risk of this disease as we, again, validate and elevate the stories of families and broaden our community. So I'm going to go to the next slide. As our international movement continues to grow, there's a few things that the NEC Society will be working on in the near future that will bring our international colleagues together. The first is our prioritized research agenda, where we're working with a team of families and researchers who are working to help us understand the questions and the topics that are related to NEC that matter most from stakeholders around the globe, and how we can begin to prioritize and then address these areas of research. The next is building a patient-led research network within the NEC Society, where families, again, from around the globe can work hand in hand with clinicians and scientists to advance meaningful and urgent research. And then finally, we're really committed to providing opportunities for our community to come together, to learn, to advance our understanding, and to build relationships with one another. We actually have a webinar taking place tomorrow on the lessons from the NICU during COVID-19. It will feature both families and providers. So I hope you'll tune in for that. We also have a lot of webinars and virtual sessions that we're planning for 2021. So we hope you'll stay tuned and join us. I wanted to leave you with a couple of questions that could help us think of things to talk about during our networking time. The first is, how do we increase collaboration between clinicians, researchers, and families that have not necessarily worked together in the past? I really feel like effective collaboration between these stakeholders are essential to our international movement. So how do we make it happen? We have some ideas, but we'd love to hear yours. And then the next question I have is, what do we need to build a more cohesive and robust international movement around NEC? So again, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and we can talk about these two questions more during the networking time. So thank you so much again to Simone and to her team. It's just such an honor and privilege to partner with you all, and I'm going to hand it off to Steve. So thank you, everybody.
Jennifer, thank you. Before Stephen began, I had a little problem with the simultaneous translation in the beginning of the presentation. To try and compensate for that, it's great that the problem was solved, but I would like to open the floor for questions. If you lost something, well, you can write on the chat your questions. I'm keeping an eye on this. If you don't have any questions, you can send the question on the chat and more towards the end of the event. We will come back and talk to Jennifer. And again, I apologize. We have these little technical problems, but they're being solved. Well, Jennifer will be with us in the Zoom meeting for the families. If there is a demand for that, she can go to the HCP's room as well. And I'd like to invite Dr. Stephen McElroy to speak about neck and chorioamnionitis. I hope I pronounced that right. Stephen, over to you.
You got it perfect. Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to the symposium and present our work. I'll go ahead and share screen. All right. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about something that has been a focus of my research for the past several years. I am a neonatologist in the United States. I work at the University of Iowa, and I'm also a scientist and have been interested in necrotizing enterocolitis for the past 15 or more years. And we're really interested in why the immature bowel acts differently than the mature bowel and makes these kids susceptible. And we use a lot of mouse models in order to try and study this. And several years ago, one of my students came to me and said, I don't understand why babies that are born to moms that have chorioamnionitis have an increased risk of neck. And I started thinking about that, and I agreed it didn't make any sense. And so I'm going to share a little bit about what we've found so far. As everybody that is on this webinar knows, neck is bad. We hate it. It is a devastating disease. It's an acute inflammatory disease. And while it does impact kids that are born at term, at least for my part of the talk, we're going to focus mostly on those kids that are born prematurely. Babies are born prematurely for a lot of reasons. And as of now, about 1 in 10 kids is born prematurely worldwide. And you can see some of the causes here. It can be because babies are too big, they're growing too large. It can be that the mom's cervix is not tightly closed, or what we call incompetence. It can be due to stress in either the fetus or the mom. But one of the most common causes is an inflammation and infection called chorioamnionitis. Chorioamnionitis, simply put, is an inflammation of the fetal membranes, the placenta, and the amniotic fluid. And what we've learned over the years is that it can be caused either by a bacterial infection, or it can be caused by what we call a sterile cause, where there's no bacteria grown, and it's triggered by other sorts of signs and danger signals that can happen to the fetus. It is the cause of about 25% of those kids that are born prematurely, and it actually correlates to the degree of prematurity. As you can see on the graph on the right, the more premature you are, the more likely that chorioamnionitis was the cause of your prematurity. So why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because we've known for a long time that there's a link between being born due to chorioamnionitis and then later development of neck. So much so that this was a study that was done in, I believe it was 2013, where they did a meta-analysis of 33 studies and were able to clearly state that if you were born because of chorioamnionitis, you had an increased odds of developing necrotizing enterocolitis. And the more severe your chorioamnionitis, or the more severe that inflammation was, the higher the likelihood that you were going to go on and develop necrotizing enterocolitis. So that leads me to the question of why. And there's not a lot of understanding of why this happens. And logically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we know that NEC usually happens days, if not weeks, after you're born. And so there's an inflammatory milieu or inflammatory surrounding the fetus that happens at birth that somehow is causing something to happen weeks later. So we turned this to the animal models in our lab. And the first thing we had to do was develop a model that simulated chorioamnionitis. And so what we do is we take a pregnant mouse and we inject that with lipopolysaccharide, which is a bacterial wall component, and that causes a big inflammation in the mom. And you can see on the graphs here, this is looking at 3 markers of inflammation. It's interleukin-1, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor. And at both 4 hours after we inject this and 4 days later, the moms that you see in red, which are exposed to this LPS, have significantly increased amounts of these inflammatory markers compared to sham controls. Now, what's really interesting is this carries through to the fetuses also. And so these are data that are taken from the mouse pups that were born to these moms. And the pups that were exposed to inflammation as a fetus, and this is 4 days prior, still have increased amounts of these inflammatory mediators in their bloodstream compared to the mice that didn't have that exposure. And so we know that moms that have this inflammation are exposing their pups or their fetuses to this inflammation. So the question is, what does that do? Well, these are 2 separate experiments, the one on the left and the one on the right, and they both use a scoring system of intestinal injury that's kind of down the middle. And to make this really kind of short and easy, if you have a 0, you're normal. If you have a 2, you have the most amount of injury. And if you're a 1, you're kind of somewhere in the middle. And what we found on the left is looking at animals that were born, they were either exposed to this fetal inflammation or not. So the exposed animals are in red, the ones that are not are in black. And we just allowed them to deliver and did nothing to them other than let the moms raise them. And we sacrificed those animals at various time points. And what was interesting was that the animals that were exposed to inflammation as a fetus always had more intestinal injury than those that didn't. And that's just at a baseline without any additional things done to them. And so it seemed that this exposure as a fetus early on caused a irritation of the bowel in all of these animals. Now, the information or the graph you see on your right is we took this one step further and said, okay, so if you look at the animals that don't have anything done to them, which are the gray animals, you compare them to the red animals, which are those that were exposed to that inflammation. We know that the injury score is higher, and you can see that the scores are closer to 1 than they are in the sham animals. What if we compare that to animals that are given inflammation later on? And so the yellow animals are those that are 7 days old. They were given a weight-adjusted same amount of inflammation, an injection of LPS that was the same amount by weight. And then the DI animals, or the animals in black, were those that were exposed to the fetal inflammation and given that second hit. And you can see those had the highest scores of all, which leads us to believe that there's an increased susceptibility to injury in these animals if they were exposed to inflammation as a fetus. Now, taking this into necrotizing enterocolitis, because that's why we're all here. So my lab has developed a model of necrotizing enterocolitis where we use 2-week-old mice and we expose them to 2 separate insults. One is disrupting a particular cell type in the intestine called the Paneth cell, and it's followed by exposing them to a increased amount of Klebsiella pneumonia in their intestine, which causes inflammation and an alteration of the bacteria in the gut. And if you expose mice to both these things, they will significantly develop injury that looks like NEC. And you can see pictures of that in the B section on this slide, where animals that were given the NEC insults have bowel that looks redder and duskier. You can see down here where there are areas that are injured compared to the animals that don't have anything done to them. And this is a pretty consistent model. We took this model and we exposed it to animals that had been exposed to that fetal inflammation. And what we found was really interesting, that you can see on the side here, animals that received Klebsiella alone, or that increased bacteria and that increased inflammation, but didn't have their panicels disrupted, started to get neck-like injury. And that tells us that the exposure to inflammation is doing something to the animal, especially maybe those panicels, that is causing an increased susceptibility to having neck in at least our animal models. Now, why the panicel is important? Panicels are a really important cell type that sits down inside of our intestines, and their job is to keep the intestines safe. They produce a lot of chemicals that are designed to kill bacteria and keep the intestine clean and infection-free. And so if you disrupt them, you increase the ability for the bacteria to cross into the intestine and start to cause damage. Now, I told you earlier that one of the markers of this chorioamnionitis that we look at is interleukin-6. And what's interesting is if we knock that out of the system, all of this injury seems to go away. And so you can see a graph here, and if you just focus on this orange bar, these are looking at sham animals compared to those animals exposed to fetal inflammation. And these, again, are those injury scores that we talked about. You can see if you lose the IL-6 in all these animals, you cannot get injury. And so it seems like this happens because of interleukin-6. And that makes a little bit of sense because there's a receptor for interleukin-6 is very present in the placenta, and it's very present in the intestine itself. And you can see that by these red dots that are all throughout both the placenta that you can see here on the left and in the intestine that you can see here on the right. And so it makes biologic sense that this interleukin-6 may be playing a key role. We also know that if you expose these animals to this fetal inflammation, you decrease their normal amount of panicels. You can see here on the left, this is looking at just counts of panicels in these animals' intestine, and in the red are animals that were exposed to inflammation as a fetus compared to the sham. And you can see that they're all lower here, meaning that they have less panicels. And if you do this in an interleukin-6 deficient animal, an animal that can't have interleukin-6, then that effect goes away. So what do we think is happening and why this may be going on? And this is an area that our lab is actively going and investigating. But we think that when you expose the fetus to inflammation, one of the big triggers is this interleukin-6. And as it moves over into the fetus, in this case, this is a mouse fetus, that triggers a chemical cascade that impacts your panicels and actually causes them to be injured and not develop normally. That allows the bacteria that's normally in the intestine to be able to get closer down to the epithelium or the surface of that intestine, cross in, and cause further inflammation that ends up looking like necrotizing enterocolitis. And we think that maybe this is why babies that are exposed to chorioamnionitis have an increased risk of developing neck. With that, I'm going to tie it up. I have to give thanks to all the people in my lab that do the awesome job of doing this hard work so that I am able to share it with everyone as well as my collaborators. And with that, I'm going to tie it up so that I keep us on time.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Now we have Dr. Jay Kim to talk about practical approaches to prevent neck in the NICU. Mr. Jay Kim, you may begin.
Thank you very much, Simona. It's a real pleasure to be participant in this panel and this conference. It's a feat to organize something like this in the middle of a pandemic. And it always touches me to hear about cases and personal stories of neck. And I've heard both Simone and Jen's story before, but it's also a big reason why we are, as advisors to Neck Society and as clinicians, why we need to keep doing more to make this situation better. So I want to cover some of the areas of ways that we've begin to understand how we may be able to prevent neck. And it's a lot to cover in such a short time, but hopefully I will hit the high points. We know that structure of the gut forms early, but that function follows later. So when we have babies coming out so immature, even at half the gestation, that we are really facing a big challenge. So the preterm gut is at risk because of the immaturity, and particularly because of the underdevelopment of the immune system and underdevelopment of the overall defense mechanism, and inability to move the way it should move, and in particular, not having the right kind of bacteria that leads to a condition we call dysbiosis. So the storm that occurs when NEC takes place is often in an immature gut, although you've heard that it can occur in a term gut, and the presence of the wrong kind of bacteria, the presence of food or milk that needs to be present, and then the formation of significant inflammation that percolates over time and takes several weeks, oftentimes in the smallest babies. So what we have found is that when this inflammation occurs, it's very difficult to manage it after that point. And so most of the effort that we've had in trying to deal with NEC revolves around prevention. So there's a long list of efforts that we have gathered from some good evidence, some less strong evidence to try to ameliorate or mitigate the development of NEC. And I hope to cover some of these high points. Of course, it would be easy if we could reduce preterm birth, but clearly over the last decade, we have made minimal progress in this area. So I want to cover some of these other aspects and give you a little bit of maybe local context, at least to Brazil. We know that antenatal steroids is powerful an effect in maturing lung, but we also know that this may have impact on reducing the chances for NEC. And we know that in the US, we've made major progress over many, many decades in increasing the use of antenatal steroids. And this has resulted in impact in mortality and other morbidities. When we compare this to Brazilian data, you can see that there's still opportunity for Brazil to increase the use of antenatal corticosteroids as at only just over half of those early preterm deliveries are their documented use. There's some controversy over whether the physiologic umbilical cord clamping, some people call it delayed cord clamping, may be beneficial. I think it's important and to recognize that even in the preterm infant, that the ability to allow for blood flow to occur after birth from the placenta to the fetus, to the newborn fetus, is important. And it may have some impact on, certainly has impact on mortality and may have impact on enterocolitis. One of the simple ways of kind of separating out your own data, and we heard earlier that in Brazil it may be challenging to make a diagnosis, is trying to really separate what are the potential causes that lead to the final pathway of the enterocolitis problem. And so in the literature, you'll find that you can get there through a number of different ways, whether it's through specific infection, specific transfusion-related complications, or even related to cow's milk protein-associated effects. One of the simple and early ways of separating out necrotizing enterocolitis from other bowel complications is separating out spontaneous intestinal perforation, because we know that this occurs in very immature infants and that there's a unique sort of profile of these kids. And these infants do not have the same degree of inflammation and seems to have much more focal perforation, and it may be related to some of the medications that we use, but also much more related to the blood flow that occurs to the gut. The most powerful impact that we know for reducing NEC involves the use of human milk, mother's milk preferably, but even donor milk, because we think it acts like a drug. So the more a preterm infant takes in human milk, the less chance that infant has of developing NEC. So in North America, we've seen a major trend towards not only using human milk as the base nutrition, but also moving from bovine-based fortifiers that fortify the human milk to even an all-human diet to try to humanize the entire intake. And data would suggest that when you provide as much human milk and human milk derivatives, including the fortifier, we can markedly reduce the incidence of NEC, and in particular, the incidence of surgical NEC. And the studies will show in other cases, so in contrast, that maybe some of the effects may be related to retinopathy of prematurity. And this study did not show, a Canadian study did not show a major effect. But when you combine those two data sets, we still see an impact on using an exclusive or all human milk diet in reducing enterocolitis in this population. So the perspective that we have is thinking about the positive and effects of what's in mother's milk and what are the negative effects of exposing infants to intact bovine protein in trying to understand how to reduce NEC. The more we use human milk, the more we are responsible for the whole journey that milk happens within the unit. So it's really important to identify all the steps from the time mom pumps to the time that milk gets to baby and be able to control the quality and the safety of each of these steps as it gets to baby. Another powerful way of improving care is just to standardize the protocols that we use, because it's very easy with many physicians and many providers to have great differences in the way we manage. And when we come to a very vulnerable preterm gut, we need to be very careful how we feed that infant. So the concept of having a standardized feeding protocol that is believed and abided to by the group, that it's in fact preferably nurse driven so that it's automated in a much more regular manner, and that there's a straight linear advancement in that protocol are essential. It's some of the essential ingredients for developing a protocol for your unit. And you can incorporate different things like trophic feeding or fortification and vitamins within that so that it's done at the same time at the right place. What we don't know is exactly how fast we should feed the smallest babies. Studies that have shown a wide range of feeding rates. And so I think what's more important is to have the protocol as rather than being very specific to what that rate of feeding is. I still think that there may be benefit for the smallest babies to have some level of trophic feeding, and that feeding at the earliest day of life can now be very comfortably within the first day after birth. We're less clear about when we need to stop, but I think whenever you feel that there's physiologic changes in that infant, that may be an appropriate time to stop. One of the biggest interpretations that has changed is our understanding of the human gut microbiota, or the microbiome. We now know that we carry another organ in our gut, and this organ is composed of many, many different bacterial species. And it's important metabolically for us, and it's important for us to exchange nutrients and metabolites with all these bacteria that are in our gut. But we know that many conditions in life, but particularly in the preterm infant, we are facing a dysbiosis where those bacteria are not correct, and they can lead to greater degrees of infection or inflammation in our babies. So even how a baby is born through vaginal birth or C-section can be greatly different in terms of the amount of the kind of bacteria that they hold, and that this can lead to long-term consequences with regards to adult conditions like allergy or immune dysfunction. And we know that what we feed our babies may be altered significantly. So a breastfed baby versus a formula-fed baby have different bacteria in their gut. In fact, one of the experiments that people have done in cesarean section babies, where people were able to swab a baby with the flora of the vaginal vault of that mother, one could partially restore the microbiota of that baby that was born by cesarean section just by coating the baby's face and mouth with those bacteria. We know that the preterm infant is coming out the wrong way, coming through C-section, and having exposure to a lot of antibiotics, often not being fed for a long time, often being exposed to infant formula instead of mother's milk, and coming into a unit that has a lot of very pathogenic bacteria. So preterm infants have the wrong bacteria, the wrong number of bacteria, and a very limited diversity of bacteria. So when we look at human milk, we see that human milk provides a combination of not only probiotics in the milk, but also prebiotics in the form of sugar. So human milk is an ideal symbiotic. And we can see in NEC that the bacteria changes even before the actual presentation of NEC. And what's unclear here is, are those bacteria changing as a cause and effect of NEC, or are they just a phenomenon that occurs because NEC is occurring? And we look deep into mother's milk, and we can see that there is a very unique signature that every mother makes a different combination of microbiota that are found in her milk, and these are critically important to providing the first kind of bacteria for the baby. So what's very prevalent now is oral colostrum care, and that's the very earliest administration of milk to babies from the very first few hours of life. And this colostrum is full of specific immunoprotective agents, and we think that this may be a way to vaccinate or inoculate babies. What we don't know is there's not as much evidence to prove exactly how it works or how powerful it can work. What we do know in the US is that at least half the units have now migrated to this practice, and we've seen no major consequences of this. And if anything, it's been a promotion of encouraging mothers to produce their own milk. Another way that extends from the use of human milk is the use of probiotics. And we now know that there's significant evidence around the world that show that the use of exogenous probiotics, it may be a way to confer better health benefits even above the use of mother's milk. What we don't know is exactly who benefits the most, and the data would suggest that in the slightly larger babies, those that are over 1,000 grams, that they may be benefiting better than those babies that are less than 1,000 grams. But suffice to say that we have evidence that bacteria and controlling the bacteria matter. Other evidence also that's supportive of this is the notion that when you eliminate acid production in preterm babies, this increases the risk for NEC, because it probably alters the defense mechanism of the stomach in protecting bad bacteria from getting into the gut. And in the same vein, using too much antibiotics has been shown in a large NICHD study to show that using prolonged therapy with antibiotics empirically when cultures are not, that cultures are negative, that this may actually worsen the development of NEC. And we think that this relates to the change in the microbiota because of prolonged use of antibiotics. And what's not often looked at is even the saturation ranges that we target our babies may affect the risk of the gut to develop NEC. And we think that those babies that are targeted in a lower range, 85 to 89%, are at higher risk, not only of death, but also of increased risk for necrotizing enterocolitis, even though that they may have a lower risk of retinopathy. And then there's been large controversy around blood transfusion and anemia, and we know that that there is a relationship that some have observed, but probably what's emerging is that the most important factor is the degree of anemia that occurs prior to the blood transfusion. So it's highly recommended now to pay very close attention to the degree of severe anemia that occurs and trying to keep preterm babies from getting very anemic, as this may set them up for the development of NEC. So to finish off, I often run a mental experiment and say, if you were sinister and wanted to actually worsen or make NEC occur, here is a way that you could do that. Don't give antenatal steroids, get the most immature, the most restricted infant, immediately clamp the cord, target low oxygen saturations, make them very anemic, feed them no human milk, feed them aggressively with the accelerating advancement, and give them protracted antibiotics, block their acid in their stomach, and also what I didn't mention is give them thickeners in their food to actually make their gut move slower. So that is to kind of give you a negative experiment of all the things that we should be avoiding to prevent NEC. And lastly, in order for real structure change for prevention of NEC, you need to develop programs within your unit that combine the emphasis of nutrition and the emphasis of lactation, since human milk is so important. And I just lead you to the site at my prior institution where we developed a program to help support a structured 10 steps to try to improve the reduction of NEC. And as always, these kids are fragile, and it takes an entire team to make these babies come out the other side better. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was a very informative lecture, very important. Now that we have introduced the problem, let's try and look at the solutions. A lot of people come to PGG and they say, my child lost the intestine and the doctor said there's the way out, but we do know that there's a way out. There are good things that we can do. I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Maria Fernanda Camargo to speak about the outpatient program for intestinal rehabilitation with babies with ultra short intestines.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'll be happy to share some of my experience with you. And actually, I graduated in pediatrics medicine, but I work mainly in nephrology and transplantation. And I ended up starting to work with intestinal rehabilitation because of a request from the Ministry of Health. They had an issue with a child and who got approval to travel abroad for an intestine transplantation. However, at the end of the day, they didn't have enough weight. This child didn't have enough weight. And since we had a program for low birth weight children in our institution, they asked me for help. So I started getting into it and I started researching how we could help develop this area. For me, it's always been important to understand that for every project, we need 3 pillars. We need efficient care, research and awareness raising, and financial accountability. This is something that patients bring to us both at public and private institutes. Now, when we have intestinal failure secondary to SBS, we have a very rare clinical condition. And if we think about our literature, we are talking about 4 to 6 cases for 1 million of the population in Europe and the US. Now, if we compare that to the Brazilian population, where we have around 206 million people, we would have around 824 cases a year. However, we haven't reached this number in Brazil. We need to look for these people. We also have no records of these children who are survivors and the patients who survive with an extra short bowel. We also don't have information on the costs that are related to that. So intestinal failure is a reduction of intestinal function below the minimum level that we need to absorb macronutrients, water, and electrolytes. And in this case, we need intravenous supplementation. Now, when we have intestinal insufficiency, we have a reduction in the absorption function of the intestines, but we don't need IV supplementation to make sure these patients are healthy. Right now, whenever we see children who survive with a very short bowel, or even in adult patients, it is important for us to forward them to rehabilitation centers. In these cases, we need to work on preventing the complications that are associated with this disease. We also need to make sure we have optimized treatments, and we need to work on a follow-up with them, even in an outpatient context. Let me talk about the strategies that we use, and we do think they are extremely important. Number one, we need family adherence. We also need a multidisciplinary team. So we need to get psychologists and social workers and nurses and nutritionists involved. We also need strategies for nutritional follow-up. It is important to rebuild the IG tract. It is also important to prevent sepsis, and this is a major challenge here, especially when we talk about traditional home care models, because oftentimes we see people who are careful about a catheter, but some of the people treating these patients are not ready to be careful. It is also very important to prevent liver failure and to preserve central venous accesses. Now, I work in nephrology, and I work with children who undergo hemodialysis, and we always try to prevent and to preserve actually these accesses so that we don't have to change it all the time and we can avoid thrombosis. It is also important to think about when we're going to recommend a transplantation for these patients, because we know that transplantation has a lot of complications, and we need to think about the right timing for it. Now, above all else, I think that in order to have family adherence, we need to understand that the experience of patients and parents is a process, and it could change over time. So we need to go back and reassess things at different points. We also need to foster a very good relationship with these families. We need to hear them. We need to understand their needs, and we need to help them adapt their reality to the moment they are going through in their lives. Because we know it is stressful to have a child at home who is going to depend on parenteral nutrition. And during their lives, we may be able to suspend parenteral nutrition, but when children have a very short bowel, they may rely on that throughout their lives, and we need to think about their quality of life. It is also about building trust. And it is just like being in a relationship. We need to build trust with these families with a lot of transparency, and both parties need to be able to talk about their concerns, and we as a team need to talk about our limits as well. So whenever we foster family engagement, safety goes up. It is also easier to have better outcomes for these patients. Satisfaction goes up, costs go down, and we improve communication between patients and teams. So at our institution, we either work with patients who became patients in our institutions, or we work with patients who are sent to us by other institutes. Now, in the case of ICU patients, we end up going there to see them, and we try and analyze if they would be able to just be hospitalized. Now, whenever they can be hospitalized, they usually go to transplantation facilities where we have a multidisciplinary team who is used to dealing with these children. And what is also important here is that oftentimes these children have been through months of hospitalization in other institutions, and we need to spend the time to understand these children, because even if they only spend months with parenteral feeding, they need to adapt again to your institution. They need to understand your routine, and they need to get used to your team before we get these people ready for a discharge. So right off the bat, before we start training these children, it is important for us to analyze whether this patient and these families are eligible, and this relies on the assessment of a multidisciplinary team. Now, whenever they are eligible, and in Brazil we don't usually do that, we have to train the family to take care of these children. And we believe that as doctors or as physicians, we are responsible for these patients to make sure that these families have parenteral feeding possibilities in their home without relying on a nurse. So since we are a private institution, we ask for the authorization of the healthcare provider, and when we get their approval, we have an informed consent form. Through the informed consent form, the family is going to know about the risks and benefits of this program, and then we share responsibilities. I always sign this form as the person who is in charge of this program. So the next step is working on this handbook. We've put together a handbook and we hand it out to families with every step of training. And we have different modules. We only go on to the next module, and we have 12 modules after the previous one is over. So it encompasses information about how to wear sterile gloves, how to wash your hands, how to have dressings for central venous catheters, and we simulate NEC here, the care that we need for gastrostomy, how to work with an infusion pump, how to work with parenteral feeding, how to handle drugs or medicine that we may need for these children, how to work with a GI feeding approach, and how to dispose of these materials. And let me say something very important. We always train 2 people in the family. One of these people has to be the mother or father. Now, the second person we'll train may be the mother and father as well, or a caretaker who is going to be chosen by the family. After we validate this training, we sign this form and we say that this family is ready for the discharge of their kid. The next step is outpatient follow-up. We have a multidisciplinary team, and we talk to these families every day through the app, and we are transitioning everything into this app. And before starting parenteral nutrition, we get a picture of what they are going to administer so that we can double check it. And every conversation that takes place is in this group. In this group, we have mothers and fathers, and we have a multidisciplinary team and a medical team. So anytime we have any recommendations or any instructions, we post it in the group. And this is only for a specific patient. At the end of the month, we get these conversations and we record them in our e-records so that everything is there. Let me talk about the children that we have right now in our program. We have 30 children and 6 patients who have been admitted to our program between July 2015 and July 2020. We transferred 5 patients and we had 1 death. Right now, we have 22 children in outpatient follow-up, and 1 of them has been hospitalized and is awaiting discharge. Usually, we get these children when they are around 6 or 7 months of age. They have an average age of 3 years. We have 12 men and 10 girls. Now, the biggest cause for intestinal failure for these patients is NEC, for 7 of them. 8 of them have a small intestine under 10 centimeters. And 6 kids have a ileocecal valve problem. Now, the score for weight and age was under minus 3.68 during hospitalization or during admission into the program, and in the last assessment, it was minus 0.45. We think that these findings are not related to demographic factors and comorbidities. Now, malnutrition for these children went from 77% to 23%. We have 14 patients with enteral probe, gastrostomy, or oral feeding, and 22 patients with parenteral nutrition. Now, if we think about a blood and metabolic assessment, we usually run it once a week. We have a micronutrient evaluation every 3 months. And we have a nutritional assessment every 15 days. Here we see the ICU time they spent in the ICU before coming into this program. Now, if we think about the time that has passed since admission to discharge, we had 4.2 months with a median of 3.45. But at the beginning, we struggled a lot because healthcare providers didn't really understand the model of this program, and they didn't understand that this would be better than traditional home care because we would be able to reduce the number of hospitalization for these patients. Now, this was a barrier. One of these kids spent 12 months, and after 2 months, they would be able to reach a discharge, but the healthcare provider would not allow for that. Now, recurrent hospitalization had a median of 1.5, and the time of recurrent hospitalization was 5. And this is a chart by child, per child. So here we see the time between admission and discharge, 3.45. And let me tell you a story of one of our first patients. This is Leonardo. He was born in January of 2015. He was extremely premature, 25 weeks of gestational age, and only 630 grams. He had enterocolitis when he was 3 months old, and he has 3 centimeters of the short bowel. This is a very severe case. He has trachea atresia. He has hypothyroidism. He's had epilepsy. He's had a number of thromboses. Now, he was transferred to the Samaritano Hospital when he was 6 months old with 2.6 kilograms. The initial hospitalization time was 4 months. We had the reconstruction of the IG tract and the adequation for parenteral nutrition. Now, he didn't leave this hospital because of the project. He was the second patient. But after a fungal sepsis, when he was hospitalized for 105 days, we were able to get him into the program. Now, along these 4 years and 2 months, he only had one catheter infection. He changed a catheter 3 times because of thrombosis or obstruction. It's been 2 years since the last prolonged hospitalization. Right now, of course, he's going through a lot of therapy, but he's able to interact and he's growing. He's proof that we are able to provide patients with quality of life. Now, here we have Julia. We also started working with Julia at a later stage. Here we had a very severe selenium deficiency with very severe secondary hypothyroidism. After having replacement for these macronutrients, she was able to resume growth. Now, this is Natalia. Natalia has under 10 centimeters for her bowel, but she's doing really well. She goes to school and she has parenteral nutrition. She is in a list for transplantation because she's had more than 2 cases of thrombosis, so we chose to put her in the transplantation list. Here we have another patient. He had 2.5 kilograms, and now he's almost 1 year old. He has a malabsorption syndrome. He doesn't have SBS. Thank you very much, Dr. Fernanda. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but we have a question for you. And I do apologize for cutting you short. Carla asks, we struggle a lot with hospitals that have no experience and have no protocols for intestinal failure. What do you think that is about? Do you think they don't want to treat for that? Do you think they have no information? What is happening here? Well, you see, more and more our ICUs are helping these children survive. But I think we have a problem of continuity. Unfortunately, right now in Brazil, we only have a few centers for intestinal rehabilitation with the full infrastructure they need. So oftentimes what happens is that these children are discharged and they go into traditional home care. And people are not used to this kind of condition. And I was a pediatric professional, but I didn't have this kind of experience 6 years ago. So I think it is just because they don't have enough knowledge about it. I don't think that they just don't want to treat for it. I think people are not aware of these conditions and they don't know that there is light at the end of the tunnel and you could offer quality of life to these children. Thank you very much, Dr. Camargo. I think it is very important for us to understand that we should keep working on intestinal rehabilitation. Please remember that after the symposium, we're going to get together in 2 Zoom meetings, one for families and one for healthcare practitioners. Now we have Dr. Jocemara Gurmini, who is also going to talk about parenteral nutrition and intestinal failure. Dr. Gurmini, you may begin.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen. I believe you can see it. So I would like to begin thanking the organizers for the invitation to be here speaking to you. I'm honored to be sharing this event with experts. I'll speak about parenteral nutrition and intestinal failure. It is a diagnosis that limited the life of many children. Today, it is treatable, and transplant is reserved to some situations. So with the progress in medicine, technical refinement, and development of solutions with fewer complications, parenteral nutrition plays an important role in the treatment of children with intestinal failure. As the decades went by, parenteral nutrition has become a way to safely and efficiently feed the babies. It can be maintained for long periods of time, even years, ensuring the child's growth and development. If we're talking about parenteral nutrition, and some concepts are important to clarify. For the European Society for Clinical Nutrition and Metabolism, intestinal failure would be the reduction of intestinal function lower than the minimum necessary for the absorption of macronutrients and or water and electrolytes. So that intravenous nutritional supplementation is necessary to maintain health and growth. For NESCAN, it would be in patients who require parenteral nutrition for more than 60 days due to gut disease, dysfunction, or resection. So the short bowel syndrome would be the situations that require parenteral nutrition for more than 60 days after intestinal resection or a small intestine with less than 25% of expected. As mentioned, we don't know what is the exact incidence in Brazil. International assessments show around 24.5 cases per 100,000 live births per year. Around 35% of these cases are due to necrotizing enterocolitis. When we talk about less than 25% of the lymph of the small bowel, well, children have varied sizes. And here we can approach the length of the gut according to the child's gestational age. So we have about 200, a term child has about 200 centimeters of small bowel. Less than that would be a short bowel syndrome. Preemies have a lower length. So values will vary according to gestational age, or I can take into account the baby's height or weight. Intestinal failure can be divided into three main groups. Short bowel syndrome, that accounts for most of the cases. Then we have congenital enteropathies due to genetic problems, and the chronic intestinal pseudo-obstruction. When we talk about short bowel, there are causes, prenatal causes, and there are also malformations, but we have intestinal atresia, volvulus, gastroschisis, omphalocele, total intestinal aganglionosis. And after the baby is born, the main causes is necrotizing enterocolitis. In other patients, we have thrombosis. We can have severe intestinal inflammatory disease or resections due to other causes. We need to take into account some situations until the patient can have intestinal autonomy, no longer needing parenteral nutrition. And that will depend on the length of the small bowel and preserved segment, presence of the ileocecal valve, if there is stomies, and the functional integrity of the residual intestine. In the last trimester of gestation, the intestine doubles its size. If the child is born prematurely, not taking into account comorbidities, this baby has a higher likelihood that the intestine will grow. And depending on the remaining intestine, the child can achieve intestinal autonomy in some situations. Normally, the short bowel syndrome occurs after resection with less than 40 to 50 centimeters of viable small intestine. And these children go to intestinal rehabilitation. So adaptation starts soon after intestinal resection. It takes about 24 to 60 months. It can take longer than that, depending on the remaining bowel that the child has. I'd like to remind you that every segment of the small intestine is responsible for the absorption of specific nutrients. We need to be aware of what was taken out and what remained to understand how to better approach the nutrition of that baby. I'd like to remind you that parenteral nutrition is going to be paramount because it's going to help us maintain the child's growth and development until the intestine can be autonomous. This is an annual report dated 2015. Figure 1 shows the diagnosis of candidates in the waiting list for intestinal transplantation. Among children, the most common diagnosis here was necrotizing enterocolitis. And in Figure 2, we have candidates in waiting list for intestine transplant. And as time went by, from 2004 onward, the number of patients in the waiting list, particularly younger than 1 year, started to drop. And perhaps this is due to strategies to avoid liver injury or damage. And that's where parenteral nutrition comes in, and the appearance of intestinal rehabilitation centers, which are very important to be able to manage these patients adequately, preventing their death. As for intestinal rehabilitation, one of the main goals would be to optimize intestinal function, to promote autonomy of the intestines, avoiding irreversible liver complications. For this kind of rehabilitation, I need parenteral nutrition with an optimized composition, avoiding complications, promoting adequate development and growth. Parenteral nutrition has to be infused somehow, and that's where we have to care for venous access and the catheters used. Catheter has to allow the adequate supply and delivery of nutrients. I need to care for the important vessels, and I need to prevent infections. These things have been mentioned by Dr. Maria Fernanda. Okay, so let's talk a little about liver disease, which would be one of the major complications, and it's linked to parenteral nutrition. Very well, when we talk about indications for intestinal transplant, this is just for illustration's sake. Liver disease, together with intestinal failure, is one of the reasons why patients go to intestinal transplant. If we're able to maintain the bowels and the liver in good conditions, most likely the child will be in rehab and will no longer need an intestinal transplant. Another item has to do with thrombosis of upper central vessels and occlusion of the brachiocephalic vein, showing that the access pathway for parenteral nutrition is key. And we need to be extremely careful to prevent the death of the patient because they simply do not have a venous access, or because they have recurring sepsis due to catheter-related complications. We'll lose the patient eventually. They won't even get to the transplant. So liver disease is the main complication in children with intestinal failure and making use of prolonged parenteral nutrition. Its prevalence is a question mark because we lack diagnostic criteria and studies with a good methodology. It is estimated that 40 to 60% of infants in long-term parenteral nutrition develop some level of cholestasis. And since we have the presence of cholestasis, it's generally defined by the elevation of serum levels of direct bilirubin, more than 2 milligrams per deciliter in children with intestinal failure receiving long-term parenteral nutrition. Among the risk factors for liver damage, we have prematurity, we have necrotizing enterocolitis or gastroschisis with or without atresia, lack of function in the intestine. So even if I have a short segment of the bowel, I need to have some food in that intestine, either orally or using a tube. Bacterial overgrowth or gram-negative sepsis, and recurring sepsis related to the catheter and the type of infusion of parenteral nutrition. Normally it is continuous, but over time, perhaps the patient would benefit from cyclic parenteral nutrition during a part of the day, and the rest of the day they would be without PN. And some cytokines, inflammatory cytokines will develop, they reach the liver. In the liver, they'll cause inflammation. At a second stage, that inflammation will become fibrosis and finally cirrhosis, making the patient, in addition of not having a sufficiently functional intestine, the child will also have a liver damage, liver injury, and that's what we need to avoid. Among the causes leading to hepatic damage, we have parenteral nutrition, catheter-related sepsis and recurring sepsis, perhaps excessive amino acids, excessive glucose, or perhaps inadequate lipid emulsion. And we have to remember the toxic components linked to parenteral nutrition: aluminum, chromium, manganese, and some deficiencies that can happen. Taurine in preemies, I need to have special amino acids to try and supply adequately what the child cannot produce. Speaking more specifically about LE, lipid emulsion. Why is that very important? Well, it is one of the first factors related to liver damage. IV lipids with a balanced or a composition based on soybean oil or sunflower oil are associated with liver damage, perhaps because they contain a high concentration of omega-6 fatty acids, higher than omega-3. And here we have the main lipid emulsions used in parenteral nutrition. More recently, people have talked more about using some lipid emulsions containing fish oil. Could be fish oil added to other types of lipids or fish oil alone. Very well. What's important to mention about this? First, omega-6 at a higher amount. Omega-6 is or linoleic acid is converted into arachidonic acid, and that can be a precursor of pro-inflammatory agents acting on the liver. We have to remember phytosterols. They are found in soy-based lipid emulsions. They can promote the inhibition of bile secretion, contributing to cholestasis. We have alpha-tocopherol that works as an antioxidant. And if we pay attention, all lipid emulsions have tocopherol. But in a soybean emulsion, I'm going to have gamma tocopherol and not alpha tocopherol. That has only 25% of its antioxidant function. Emulsions with fish oil have alpha tocopherol that has an antioxidant effect, which is more effective. Also talking about emulsions with medium chain triglycerides. Here, there is no evidence that it will improve liver damage. So this is up to fish oil. Here I bring you some items regarding this consensus on lipid emulsion in parenteral nutrition. A group of experts met in Miami in 2018, and based on that meeting, this publication came out. They met in November 2018, and this is information regarding parenteral lipid emulsion. First, there is evidence that lipid emulsions with fish oil might offer advantages over conventional emulsions in infants and pediatric patients because they reduce the risk of cholestasis, reduces oxidative stress and lipid peroxidation. They provide long-chain PUFAs that are also important for the development of the central nervous system, particularly in premature babies. They have anti-inflammatory effect given the omega-3 content, an optimal omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and they supply middle chain triglycerides to reverse cholestasis. This is based on some cohort studies and on clinical experience. Perhaps we should use lipid emulsion with fish oil, and of course, managing other risk factors, avoiding bacterial overgrowth, avoiding catheter-related infection, and so on and so forth. Once the patient already has established liver disease, if parenteral nutrition, they're not using fish oil, the suggestion is that it be added, exchanging or switching to a fish oil containing emulsion. In the case of direct bilirubin that remains high, even with that switch, perhaps a suggestion would be to use lipid emulsion with fish oil only, without the other lipid components in the lipid emulsion. And this should not be used for a long period of time, under 15 days, because the patient might develop deficiency of essential fatty acids. So this would be a measure, a rescue measure for the liver to prevent liver damage from progressing. As my final remarks, in recent decades, the improvement of solutions for parenteral nutrition allow for an optimized combination, which, in addition to ensuring macro and micronutrients, help ensure growth and minimize complications. While the appearance of a liver lesion is a limiting factor in intestinal rehabilitation, and perhaps fish oil containing emulsions can offer advantages, multidisciplinary teams trained for rehabilitation allow for longer survival. These trained multidisciplinary teams will be able to address all of the points I mentioned here. And it is urgent that parenteral nutritional therapy at home, in the home setting, will be offered for all patients, including patients treated in the public healthcare system. Because that's a difficulty. It is possible for private healthcare patients. Not all insurance companies know how to work with short bowel syndrome. And other patients on intestinal rehabilitation, they have to be rehabilitated in the hospital setting. Sometimes they have to stay in the hospital for a year because I cannot send these patients in the public hospital setting, cannot let them go home, I cannot discharge them. So it's very important that we have this in all of the Brazilian states. So we have good HCPs. We just need the weapons to be able to work with this adequately. I'd like to remind you that we cannot do this alone. We need a team. There are several professionals that make part of the team, and they're very important in managing a patient on intestinal rehabilitation. This is what I had for you. I hope it didn't go over the time allotted to me. And once again, thank you for your attention. Wonderful, Dr. Jocemara. This was very important. Now we're going to invite our last speaker, Linseigh Green. She's wonderful, and she's a NEC survivor. And she will be ending this event. We talked about the problem, potential solutions to the problem, and now what comes after NEC and the hope. And again, I'd like to stress the invitation that you join us in the Zoom networking rooms. You'll have a chance to ask questions, talk to the speakers, and the links are on the chat. Linseigh, over to you. You're wonderful.
Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Linseigh Green. I am a writer, student, and performer, and I work with the NEC Society on patient-family advocacy, social media, and research. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia on August 13th, 1997 at 38 weeks gestation. I weighed only 4 pounds and 14 ounces. The problems began immediately: low blood pressure, a heart murmur, low glucose, lung issues. I was sent straight to the NICU. 2 weeks later, I was diagnosed with NEC, and shortly thereafter, I underwent surgery in which part of my bowel was removed. Following a second operation in November, I was sent home. Now, I always like to pause here because I think it's important to remind everyone that the NEC survivor community is incredibly colorful and diverse. Please do not see me as the definition of a NEC survivor because in comparison to many members of my community, I got off pretty easy. This one perspective will not help you fully understand life after NEC. For that, you will need to listen to as many of our voices as possible. I also thank you in advance for your patience and open-mindedness. At the end of the day, I'm a young person who's striving for normalcy, and some of what I am about to disclose is kind of embarrassing to say in front of an audience. I had a very happy childhood. While my parents assumed they'd left NEC and all of its horrors behind, there were a few things that made me a little different, even though I saw myself as normal. In every other baby or toddler photo you see of me, I'm holding my hand like this. I had a habit of moving my fingers like an anemone in front of my face, and I get lost in them and sink into a dreamland. My mother found it rather odd and called it playing with my fingers. One day in preschool, the special education teacher caught me doing this during nap time. She detected it as a problem and decided to evaluate me to see if I needed to be in her classroom. I was told all the other kids received the same test, but my teacher later told my mom that was not the case. The special education teacher said that while the hand habit was a sign I may have had a sensory issue, I did not belong in her class. The next oddity was my athleticism, or lack thereof. I was horrible when it came to anything involving a ball. My physical education teacher pulled my mom aside. Underdeveloped. The third issue was food. If I ate more than a small amount in one sitting, I would grow ill and often vomit. When I was a little girl, I could no longer tolerate milk. And when I became a teenager, very fatty foods such as hamburgers, donuts, French fries, and greasy pizza became hard to digest. I've always loved food. It's just that often it lands in my stomach like a block of cement. I've always struggled with being underweight, so this abnormality did not help very much. Now, when I had NEC, Google did not exist. The only information my parents had access to was a paragraph in a book on preemies the nurse had given them. And in that paragraph was the only detail they'd have about what to expect for my future. It said that by the age of 7, it would become evident that my academic performance would be poor in comparison to that of my peers. My mom, a teacher, worked with me constantly to ensure I could keep up in school, stacking the table with workbooks after school and over the summer. She called it love work, but it didn't feel like love to me. I didn't realize she was afraid that I might fall behind. When I was 7, I was a level ahead in almost every subject, and now I attend the University of Cambridge as an international student. If my parents had given up on me, I don't know if I would be where I currently am. Now, probably the most obvious thing that made me different was the visible one, my scar. When the surgeon removed part of my bowel, it saved my life, and my scar was a sign of that gift. I was fascinated with my scar. I'd often trace it with my finger, and my touch was gentle because contact always made my nerves scream. The scar seemed natural, not because I always had it, but because my teddy bear had stitching just like it. It looked neat and manufactured, which was a blessing because my surgeon's nickname was Dr. Butcher. He was notorious for leaving babies with careless, sloppy scars, which the patients were stuck with for life. Many NEC survivors are ashamed of their bodies. I've spoken to parents of children as young as 3 who are afraid to go to the pool because their scar would be exposed. For some reason, I was an anomaly. My scar was my best feature. I thought it made me the chosen one, like Harry Potter, so when I went to the pool, I was sure to wear a bikini so I could show it off. At school, I'd ask my classmates, "Guess what? I have a scar," and they were really jealous. But my relationship with my scar was about as turbulent as a Hollywood marriage. Some mornings before school, I'd curl into a ball on my bed and cry that my scar hurt. It felt like I was being stabbed in the stomach, and it was worse than any pain I'd ever felt before. My parents thought I was being a drama queen as usual, and because these episodes were brief and infrequent, we didn't pay much attention to them. Then, when I was 16, I started the day with that same type of pain, but this time it did not go away. By the end of the day, it felt like I was being carved up for Christmas dinner, back and forth, deeper and deeper. I went to the emergency room, and at first the clinicians assumed it was my period, but I had recently finished my cycle, and then I was tested for a urinary infection, and the results came back negative. As hypothesis after hypothesis was tossed out, the pain grew so bad, I found myself mentally preparing for death. Finally, a nurse mentioned she'd heard something about long-term complications of NEC, and we didn't know such issues were possible, but that was the culprit. I was transferred to a larger hospital downtown, and by the time I arrived, I was shaking violently, drifting in and out of consciousness, and vomiting uncontrollably. My blood pressure was extremely low, and I was given morphine. A CT scan revealed that I had scar tissue and adhesions, and my digestive system was frozen in place. I was told I'd need surgery, but in the end, I was sent home with an enema and told to eat better. Now, after that incident, my life never returned to normal. The amount of food I could tolerate grew smaller. I had to return to the hospital at least once a year with regular, smaller episodes in between, and I was usually constipated. I learned hiding the pain at school was necessary if I wanted to have a normal future. And each time I visited the hospital, it was the same story. I'd get a CT scan, and then I'd be an eyelash away from surgery, and they'd change their minds at the last minute. Then I'd be told, "No, it has nothing to do with NEC. That's a baby issue." They never knew what was wrong with me, but they always knew what wasn't. "Honey, you seriously need to be taking better care of yourself. Lay off the burgers and fries, okay?" You may remember me saying earlier that I cannot and do not eat either of those things. My diet is mainly vegetarian. I am almost always blamed for poor life choices I did not make. One time, my university refused to grant permission for paramedics to come to my dorm room unless I confessed that I had overdosed, had alcohol poisoning, or was pregnant. I was shaking violently with pain and my teeth were chattering and I could hardly speak. But I truthfully told them that I was a virgin and had never touched substances. It took them over an hour to let the resident assistant call an ambulance. And then when I was 18, an OBGYN would not let me leave her office until I admitted I was pregnant because I mentioned I was having a lot of abdominal pain. She scolded me for 45 minutes for lying about my virginity. Then she examined me and discovered that I was telling the truth. It is always harder to believe my words than it is to believe I've made a poor life choice and refused to tell the truth. I've tried to find help with addressing my long-term issues, but finding a clinician who cares for adults and knows about NEC or believes my condition exists is hard. My GI told me there was no point in seeing her because not enough research had been done for her to be able to help me. Last year, I started having new problems. Sometimes I was too weak to hold a pen or type. My knees shook wildly and I started falling. My brain felt foggy and it became harder to do simple assignments. I was so scared that I wrote my school and said that I didn't think I could make it to graduation. My class advisor asked to meet with me, and he admitted that they'd been receiving concerned emails from me since I was a freshman, and I should have been connected with accommodations a lot sooner. I struggled with teachers who gave me a hard time about needing to miss class or called me out for needing to use the restroom frequently. I've been asked, "Can you turn off your symptoms during my class?" And one teacher betrayed my confidence and used my health issues to humiliate me in front of my peers the entire term. Those accommodations could have offered me legal protection and validation. I didn't know I was qualified because I still didn't think of myself as having issues despite all the things that were going wrong with my body. Now, the falling eventually stopped, but it returned this summer. And I'm often dizzy and I black out quite a bit. Sometimes I get this needling pain in random parts of my body. The front of my head feels like it's being hammered in sometimes, and I often feel like I'm being dropped into an anthill. I always drop things and then seize up. And I often miss my mouth when I drink, so my face and clothes are very well hydrated. Sometimes, after I use the toilet, I'm crying and paralyzed with nerves. One day, 3 months ago, I was walking down the hall when all of a sudden I heard myself hyperventilating in a rhythmic bang, bang, bang against this wall right here. And I opened my eyes and found myself face to face with the floor, and random parts of my body were bruised. I didn't know what was wrong with me, and I just started crying. I am worried about my future, and not in the way most 23-year-olds are. And it is easy to feel hopeless because hardly any research has been done on long-term NEC outcomes on a national or global scale. The NEC Society is working on a wonderful project to help articulate our problems and needs, but that's just a start. Now, I understand we cannot solve everything overnight, and it takes lots of patience. I understand that we aren't exactly a priority when it comes to addressing NEC-related issues. But please do not save our lives only to forget about us. Our quality of life counts for something. And remember, I have it a lot easier than most. We are still relevant, and not as a subcategory, but as active members of the NEC community who are ready to share and work with you. We can start by building a world in which survivors are believed, in which we can access follow-up care, and in which our healthcare providers know what NEC is. This is our cry for help. You determine our futures. Now, you've just completed the first step, which is listening, and I appreciate that very much. The next step is action. This is a hopeful one. It means there may be a day in which I can hear, "Yes, I believe you. Yes, I can help you." Thank you.
That is beautiful, Linseigh. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you here with us and to have all of these experts with us. Thank you for attending and thank you for being a part of it. We will be sending out a survey so that we can make our next event even better. Now, I would like to invite everyone to our virtual networking sessions. We have the family room and the healthcare practitioners room. Thank you so much.